He was 5 years old and had never spoken a single word. His parents had tried everything, but nothing worked. One Sunday, they decided to take him to church, hoping the change of scenery might help. As they entered the quiet, sunlit chapel, his eyes landed on a small Virgin Mary statue near the altar. Everyone else seemed to blur into the background, but he stared, mesmerized. Then, softly, a single word escaped his lips. "Mama." His parents froze, hearts racing, unable to believe what they were hearing. In that moment, the ordinary church became a place of extraordinary hope, a miracle they had been waiting for all along. Stay with me until the end, because this story will move you in ways you never imagined. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Little Marcus had been different from the very beginning. When other babies his age were babbling and making sounds, Marcus remained silent. His mother, Elena, would sing lullabies to him every night, hoping to hear even the smallest response. His father, David, would read stories aloud, waiting for any sign of recognition. But Marcus lived in a world of silence that seemed impossible to break. The diagnosis came when Marcus turned 3. Severe autism spectrum disorder with selective mutism. The doctor's words echoed through the sterile office like a verdict. Elena gripped David's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They had suspected something was different, but hearing it aloud made it real and spoke in a way that shattered their hearts. What followed were months of therapy sessions, specialist appointments, and sleepless nights filled with research. Elena quit her job as a nurse to become Marcus's full-time advocate. David worked extra hours to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Their kitchen table became a command center covered with medical reports, therapy schedules, and phone numbers of every specialist within 100 miles. Marcus had his routines, and any disruption would send him into distress. He woke up at exactly 6:15 every morning. He ate his breakfast from the same blue bowl, sitting in the same chair, facing the window that overlooked their small backyard garden. After breakfast, he would line up his toy cars in precise rows, organizing them by color and size. Red cars first, then blue, then yellow, then green. If anyone dared to move even one car out of place, Marcus would become inconsolable until everything was restored to his exact specifications. The silence in their home was deafening. Other families filled their houses with the chatter of children, but Elena and David lived in a world where communication happened through gestures, glances, and an intuition that parents of special needs children develop over time. They learned to read Marcus's moods through the tilt of his head, the way he arranged his toys, and the intensity of his gaze. Night, Elena would lie awake listening to the sounds of their neighborhood, children playing in nearby yards, their laughter carrying through open windows. She wondered what Marcus's voice would sound like. Would it be high and sweet like other boys his age? Would he have David's deep laugh or her musical tone when he sang? These were questions that haunted her quiet moments. David threw himself into research with the determination of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. He read every study, joined online forums, and connected with other parents who were walking the same difficult path. Some had success stories that gave him hope. Others shared struggles that made him realize they weren't alone in their journey. The breakthrough moments were small but precious. When Marcus was 4, he began making eye contact for brief seconds. Elena celebrated this like other parents celebrate first steps. When he started pointing at objects he wanted, David felt like they had won the lottery. These tiny victories kept them going through the harder days. Their friends and extended family meant well, but their suggestions often stung more than helped. Have you tried this new diet? I read about a therapy that works miracles. Maybe he just needs more discipline. Elena learned to smile politely while her heart broke a little more each time. People who had never lived with autism offered solutions as if they were simple math problems waiting to be solved. The financial strain was enormous. Insurance covered basic services, but the specialized therapies, the dietary supplements, the sensory equipment that made Marcus more comfortable. All of that came out of their savings. David picked up weekend work. Elena started a small online business making handmade crafts during Marcus's nap times. Every dollar was carefully budgeted. Every expense weighed against its potential benefit for their son. Marcus attended a special education program at the local elementary school. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was a gentle woman with endless patience who had worked with autistic children for over 20 years. She saw something in Marcus that others missed. There's intelligence behind those eyes, she would tell Elena during their monthly conferences. He understands far more than he can express. We just need to find his way of communicating. At home, Marcus developed an unusual fascination with books, not reading them as he had no words, but arranging them. He would spend hours organizing the family's small library by height, then by color, then by the thickness of their spines. Elena began to notice patterns in his choices. He always placed books with religious imagery in a separate stack. Pictures of angels, crosses, or biblical scenes would catch his attention in ways that other images did not. The family rarely attended church. David had grown up in a religious household, but had drifted away during college. Elena believed in God, but found organized religion intimidating. With Marcus requiring constant attention and their schedules packed with therapy appointments, Sunday mornings were usually spent at home, recovering from the week's exhaustion. But something began to shift in Elena's heart as the months passed. She found herself praying during Marcus's difficult moments, whispering desperate pleas for help, for breakthrough, for hope. She started noticing churches they passed while driving to appointments. The architecture, the stained glass windows, the peaceful gardens surrounding many of them, all began to call to something deep within her spirit. David noticed the change in his wife. She had always been strong, the rock that held their family together. But lately, there was a different quality to her strength, a softness mixed with determination, a peace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own reserves. One particularly challenging week, when Marcus had several meltdowns, and Elena felt like she was drowning in the demands of daily life, she made a decision. "I want to try taking Marcus to church this Sunday," she told David over dinner. "I know it might be difficult with his routines, but I have this feeling we should try." David looked at her with surprise. They had talked about faith occasionally, usually late at night when they were both exhausted and searching for meaning in their struggles. But this was the first time either of them had suggested taking action. "Are you sure? You know how he gets in new environments." Elena nodded, her resolve strengthening as she spoke. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that some of her students do better in quiet, structured environments. Maybe the calm atmosphere of a church service would be good for him. And honestly, I think I need it too. I need to feel connected to something bigger than this daily struggle. That Saturday night, Elena prepares Sunday Marcus clothes carefully. She chose his softest shirt, the one that wouldn't irritate his sensitive skin. She packed a small bag with his favorite toys and some snacks, just in case the service lasted longer than his patience could handle. David researched nearby churches online, looking for one that might be welcoming to families with special needs children. They chose St. Michael's, a small Catholic church, about 15 minutes from their home. The website mentioned that families were welcome and that the congregation was known for being inclusive and understanding. Elena called ahead and spoke with Father Rodriguez, explaining their situation. His warm voice immediately put her at ease. "All children are welcome in God's house," he had said. "Don't worry about any disruptions. Our community understands that faith comes in many forms, and we're honored to have your family join us." Sunday morning arrived with the crisp promise of early autumn. Marcus followed his usual routine, but Elena noticed he seemed more alert than normal. As she helped him dress, he stood still, instead of fidgeting. When she combed his hair, he looked directly at her reflection in the mirror for several seconds, something that rarely happened. The drive to St. Michael's was quiet except for the soft music Elena had chosen for the car stereo. Marcus sat in his car seat, looking out the window with unusual focus. David gripped the steering wheel, nervous about how this experiment would go, but determined to support his wife's intuition. As they pulled into the church parking lot, Elena felt her heart racing with anticipation mixed with anxiety. This was the moment they would discover whether their family could find a place in this traditional setting, whether Marcus could handle the new environment, whether this leap of faith would bring them closer to the breakthrough they even really been praying for were praying. As they walked through the heavy wooden doors of St. Michael's, Marcus immediately stopped. The sanctuary was filled with golden morning light streaming through tall, stained glass windows and the scent of incense. The old wood created an atmosphere unlike anywhere Marcus had ever been. Elena held her breath, waiting for signs of distress that usually came with new environments. But something extraordinary happened. Instead of clinging to Elena's leg or showing signs of anxiety, Marcus stepped forward on his own. His eyes swept across the church with intense curiosity. The high vaulted ceilings, the rows of wooden pews, the flickering candles near the altar, everything seemed to captivate him in a way his parents had never witnessed before. Father Rodriguez approached them with a gentle smile. "You must be the Johnson family," he said in a soft voice that immediately put them at ease. "Welcome to St. Michael's." Marcus looked up at the priest without the usual aversion to strangers that characterized most of his interactions. For a moment, Elena thought she saw recognition in her son's eyes, as if he somehow understood they were in a sacred place. They chose seats near the back, just in case they needed to make a quick exit. Elena had packed his comfort items, but Marcus didn't reach for any of them. Instead, he sat quietly between his parents, his gaze fixed on the front of the church, where a beautiful statue of the Virgin Mary stood in an alcove surrounded by small white candles. The service began with the gentle sound of the organ. Music had never particularly interested Marcus before, but something about these hymns seemed to reach him. Elena watched in amazement as her son's breathing became slower and more rhythmic, as if the melodies were calming him in ways that no therapy had ever achieved. During the first reading, Marcus remained perfectly still, his usual fidgeting, the need to organize objects around him, the restless energy that typically marked his behavior in new places. None of it appeared. David leaned over to Elena and whispered, "I've never seen him this calm." She nodded, afraid to speak too loudly and break whatever spell seemed to have settled over their son. As Father Rodriguez began his homily, he spoke about hope in times of darkness, about faith when circumstances seem impossible, about miracles that come to those who believe. Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. These words spoke directly to her heart, to the years of struggle, to the nights spent wondering if they would ever hear their son's voice. It was during the priest's reflection on divine love that something unprecedented began to happen. Marcus slowly stood up in the pew. Elena reached out instinctively to guide him back to his seat, but David gently caught her hand. "Wait," he whispered. "Look at him." Marcus was staring intently at the Virgin Mary statue. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. His lips began to move, not in the absent way they sometimes did during his private moments, but with purpose and intention. Elena's heart began racing. She had seen this lip movement before, during quiet times at home, but never with such deliberate focus. The congregation was deep in prayer, heads bowed in reverence. But Marcus remained standing, his small figure silhouetted against the morning light, his gaze never leaving the statue. Elena noticed that his hands were no longer clenched at his sides as they usually were in stressful situations. Instead, they hung naturally, relaxed, and peaceful. Father Rodriguez concluded his homily and invited the congregation to join in communal prayer. As voices rose together in unison, Marcus took a step into the aisle. Elena's maternal instincts kicked in, and she started to follow him. But David placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let's see what happens," he said quietly. Marcus walked slowly toward the front of the church. His steps were deliberate and sure, unlike his usual hesitant movements in unfamiliar places. Several parishioners noticed the small boy making his way down the aisle, but instead of concern, their faces showed gentle understanding. This community had clearly embraced children with special needs before. As Marcus approached the altar area, he stopped directly in front of the Virgin Mary statue. The morning sun had shifted, creating a natural spotlight that seemed to illuminate both the statue and the little boy standing before it. Elena could barely contain her emotions as she watched her son, who had never shown interest in religious imagery at home, standing in what appeared to be reverent contemplation. The church fell into a natural quiet as the formal prayers concluded. It was in this moment of peaceful silence that Marcus lifted his small hands and placed them together in front of his chest. Elena gasped softly. No one had ever taught him this gesture of prayer, yet he performed it with the natural grace of someone who had done it countless times before. Mrs. Patterson had been right about the intelligence behind Marcus's eyes. Standing there in the sacred space, his posture and demeanor revealed a depth of understanding that went beyond his inability to communicate verbally. It was as if something within him recognized the holiness of this place and responded to it in ways that transcended normal developmental expectations. Father Rodriguez, who had been organizing his notes at the podium, noticed Marcus and quietly approached. He knelt down to the child's eye level, maintaining a respectful distance. "Hello, little one," he said gently. "Do you like our church?" Marcus turned toward the priest, and for the first time in his young life, made sustained eye contact with a stranger for more than a few seconds. Elena wiped tears from her cheeks as she watched this interaction. David reached for her hand, his own emotions barely contained. They had dreamed of moments like this, their son connecting with another human being, showing interest in the world around him, demonstrating the awareness they knew was locked inside his silent world. The organ began playing a soft recessional hymn, but Marcus remained motionless before the statue. His lips continued moving in what appeared to be silent conversation. Elena found herself wondering what her son might be experiencing in this moment. Was he simply fascinated by the artistic beauty of the carved figure? Or was something deeper happening? Something that touched the spiritual core that exists within every human soul. As the service officially ended and parishioners began filing out, several members of the congregation approached Elena and David. Their words were filled with warmth and acceptance. "Your son is beautiful," one elderly woman said. "We hope you'll come back next Sunday." A young mother with her own children added, "St. Michael's is a place for all families. Your little boy is always welcome here." These interactions filled Elena's heart with hope. For so long, they had felt isolated by Marcus's condition. Play dates were difficult. Family gatherings required extensive preparation. Public outings often ended in stress and embarrassment. But here, in this sacred space, they felt embraced by a community that saw beyond diagnosis to the precious child that Marcus truly was. Father Rodriguez walked over to where Marcus still stood. "Would you like to light a candle?" he asked softly. Marcus looked up at him, then at the small votive candles flickering near the statue. Without any verbal response, he nodded. A clear, deliberate gesture that made Elena's heart soar. Father Rodriguez guided Marcus's small hand as together they lit a new candle and placed it among the others. The flame danced gently in the quiet air, casting moving shadows on the carved face of the Virgin Mary. Marcus watched the light with intense concentration, as if memorizing every flicker. Elena realized that this moment would be burned into her memory forever. Her silent son participating in an act of faith, connecting with something greater than himself in ways she had never imagined possible. As they finally prepared to leave, Marcus took one last long look at the statue. Elena thought she saw his lips form a single word, though no sound emerged. She couldn't be certain, but it looked like he might have said, "Thank you." The possibility sent shivers down her spine and filled her with anticipation for what might come next in their remarkable journey. Walking back to their pew felt like floating on air. Elena's hands trembled as she gathered their belongings. David kept looking back at Marcus, as if afraid this peaceful version of their son might disappear at any moment. But Marcus remained calm, his small hand reaching up to hold Elena's as they made their way toward the exit. The drive home was filled with a different kind of silence than they were accustomed to. This wasn't the heavy, worried quiet that usually surrounded their family. This was peaceful, hopeful, charged with possibility. Marcus sat in his car seat, gazing out the window with what Elena could only describe as contentment. That afternoon, Marcus's behavior continued to surprise them. Instead of immediately arranging his toys in their usual precise patterns, he sat quietly in the living room, his attention drifting toward the window. Elena noticed he kept looking up at the sky, his lips moving in that same purposeful way they had in church. David called his mother that evening to share what had happened. "Mom, you wouldn't believe it. He was like a different child, calm, focused, almost like he belonged there." His mother, who had been praying for Marcus since his diagnosis, wept tears of joy on the other end of the line. Elena found herself researching St. Michael's online that night. She read about the history of the church, the community outreach programs, the welcoming atmosphere that Father Rodriguez had cultivated over his 15 years of service. Something deep in her spirit told her this was more than coincidence. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Marcus woke up at his usual 6:15, but instead of going straight to his breakfast routine, he walked to the living room window. Elena watched from the hallway as he stood there, hands pressed against the glass, looking up at the morning sky. His lips were moving again, and this time she was certain she could make out actual words, though spoken so softly she couldn't distinguish them. Mrs. Patterson noticed changes in Marcus at school that week. During their Friday conference call, she sounded excited. "Elena, something is different. Marcus made eye contact with me 3 separate times during circle time. He's never done that before. And when I read a story about kindness, he actually smiled. A real, genuine smile." Elena shared about their Sunday church visit, and Mrs. Patterson's voice filled with understanding. Sometimes children on the spectrum respond powerfully to environments that engage multiple senses in calming ways. The music, the visual beauty, the peaceful atmosphere. It makes perfect sense that Marcus would find comfort there. But Elena sensed this was about more than sensory comfort. There was something spiritual happening with her son, something that transcended clinical explanations. She began reading about faith and children with special needs, discovering stories of families who had found healing and hope through Saturday Spiritual Communities evening. As Elena was preparing Marcus for bed, he did something that made her heart skip a beat. Instead of his usual bedtime routine, he walked to his bookshelf and pulled out a children's Bible that had been gathering dust for months. Elena had forgotten it was even there, a gift from David's mother when Marcus was born. Marcus opened the book and flipped through the pages until he found an illustration of Mary holding baby Jesus. He stared at the picture with the same intensity he had shown the statue in church. Then, in a moment that took Elena's breath away, he gently kissed the page. "David, come here quickly," Elena whispered urgently. David rushed into Marcus's room and saw his son cradling the Bible, his finger tracing the outline of Mary's face in the illustration. They stood together in the doorway, afraid to move or speak, watching their child interact with sacred imagery in ways that defied everything they thought they knew about his capabilities. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed replaying every moment of the past week. The peaceful behavior in church, the sustained eye contact with Father Rodriguez, the way Marcus had participated in lighting the candle, the changes Mrs. Patterson was observing at school. It felt like watching her son wake up from a long sleep. Sunday morning arrived with Marcus already dressed and waiting by the front door. Elena found him there at 7:30, wearing his church clothes, holding the children's Bible against his chest. He looked up at her with clear, purposeful eyes and pointed toward the door. No words were necessary. He wanted to go back to St. Michael's. The second visit was even more remarkable than the first. Marcus walked confidently down the aisle, no longer hesitant about the unfamiliar environment. He took his place in the same pew they had occupied the week before, but this time his attention wasn't just focused on the Virgin Mary statue. He seemed to be absorbing everything: the stained glass windows, the altar, the cross-hanging Father Rodriguez's homily about above the sanctuary. During answered prayers, Marcus stood up again, but this time, instead of walking toward the altar, he remained in place, his small hands clasped together in prayer position. Elena watched in amazement as her son's lips moved in what was clearly intentional communication, though still without audible sound. An elderly parishioner sitting nearby leaned over to Elena. "That little boy is PR tears saying," she whispered within her eyes. "I can see it in his posture, in his face. He's having a conversation with God." Elena nodded, unable to speak past the emotion rising in her throat. After the service, Father Rodriguez approached their family again. "Marcus seems very comfortable here," he observed. "Would you be interested in having him participate in our children's ministry? We have a wonderful program for kids with different abilities." Elena looked at David, both of them amazed that their son was being invited to participate in something they had never imagined possible. The following week brought more changes. Marcus began showing interest in religious music. When Elena played hymns softly in the house, he would stop whatever he was doing and listen with complete attention. He started pointing to pictures of angels and crosses in magazines and books, always with that same reverent expression he wore in church. Mrs. Patterson called with more encouraging news. "Marcus participated in art therapy yesterday. When I gave him crayons and paper, he drew something I've never seen from him before. It looked like a church with a figure standing in front of it. The detail was remarkable for a child his age, especially one with his communication challenges." Elena requested a copy of the drawing and was stunned by what she saw. The church Marcus had drawn looked remarkably similar to St. Michael's, complete with the arched doorways and tall windows. The figure standing in front was small, clearly meant to represent a child. But most amazing of all, there was another figure beside the child, taller, with something covering her head that looked distinctly like a veil. David studied the drawing for long minutes. "Elena, look at this. He's drawn himself, but he's not alone. Who do you think this other figure is supposed to be?" Elena felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she realized what her son might have been trying to communicate through his art. That Saturday, Marcus did something that left both parents speechless. During his usual evening routine, instead of lining up his cars by color, he arranged them in the shape of a cross. When Elena tried to help him organize them in his typical pattern, he gently moved her hand away and pointed to his cross formation, nodding emphatically. Elena sat on the floor beside him. "Studying this to you?" she asked, soft, this important new behavior. Marcus Isley, her son, looked directly at her, maintaining eye contact longer than he ever had before, and nodded again. Then he picked up his favorite teddy bear and placed it at the center of the cross, where they intersected. Davi, two lines marveling at what they'd joined them on the floor. M's son, who had never shown interest in symbolic, were witnessing. Their play was creating meaningful arrangements that seemed to represent spiritual concepts. "It's like he's trying to tell us something," David said quietly. "Something about what he's experiencing." Elena began to wonder if Marcus's silent world had been filled with communication all along. Communication that went beyond words and touched something deeper. Perhaps his apparent isolation had actually been a form of connection that she and David had never understood. Perhaps his silence had been preparation for something greater than they could have imagined. Sunday morning brought another surprise. As they prepared for church, Marcus walked to Elena's jewelry box and pointed to a small silver cross necklace she rarely wore. When she put it on, he smiled with obvious approval. Then he went to David's dresser and retrieved a tie pin in the shape of a cross that had belonged to David's father. At St. Michael's that morning, Marcus's behavior reached a new level of engagement. During the responsive readings, when the congregation spoke in unison, Elena noticed that Marcus's lips were moving in perfect synchronization with the group. He couldn't be reading the words, but somehow he seemed to be participating in the communal prayer. Father Rodriguez noticed too. After the service, he knelt down to Marcus's level. "You're becoming quite the little prayer warrior, aren't you?" he said gently. Marcus looked at the priest, and for the first time since Elena could remember, attempted to make a sound. It wasn't a word, but it was clearly intentional vocalization, a soft humming that seemed to match the melody of the hymns they had sung. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Her son was trying to sing. After 5 years of silence, Marcus was attempting to join his voice with others in worship. The sound was barely audible, more breath than tone, but it was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. As they walked to their car that morning, Elena felt a profound shift in her understanding of her son's journey. What she had perceived as limitation was revealing itself to be preparation. What had seemed like isolation was transforming into the deepest kind of connection, and what had appeared to be silence was about to become the most meaningful voice she could ever imagine hearing. The stage was being set for something miraculous. Elena could feel it in the way Marcus held himself differently now, with confidence and purpose. She could see it in his eyes, which held a depth and awareness that seemed to grow stronger each day. And she could sense it in the atmosphere around their family, as if heaven itself was preparing to break through in ways that would change everything they thought they knew about faith, hope, and the power of divine love. The following Monday morning transformed into something Elena would remember for the rest of her life. Marcus woke up at his usual time, but instead of heading to the kitchen for breakfast, he walked directly to the front window. Elena watched from the hallway as he pressed his small palms against the glass and began moving his lips with deliberate intention. This wasn't the absent-minded lip movement they had observed before. This was focused, purposeful, as if he were having an actual conversation with someone only he could see. Elena approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. As she drew closer, she could barely make out whispered sounds. Still not quite words, but definitely intentional communication. "Marcus, sweetie, who are you talking to?" Elena asked gently. Her son turned toward her, and in that moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. There was recognition there, understanding, and something else she had never seen before. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Marcus pointed toward the sky, then placed his small hand over his heart. Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. Somehow, her son was trying to tell her about a connection he was experiencing, something that touched the deepest part of his being. David joined them in the living room, coffee mug in hand, ready to start another day of their carefully structured routine. But when he saw Marcus standing at the window, still in his pajamas, communicating silently with the morning sky, he set his coffee down and approached with the reverent quiet of someone witnessing something sacred. "How long has he been doing this?" David whispered to Elena. "About 10 minutes. David, look at his face. Really look at him. Something is happening." They stood together, watching their son continue his silent conversation. The morning light streaming through the window seemed to illuminate Marcus in a way that made the ordinary moment feel extraordinary. Elena found herself praying silently, asking for wisdom to understand what her child was experiencing. Mrs. Patterson called that afternoon with news that made Elena's heart race with excitement. "Elena, I need to tell you about something remarkable that happened during music therapy today. We were listening to a classical piece, something peaceful and flowing, when Marcus stood up and walked to the center of the room." Elena gripped the phone tighter. "What did he do?" He began moving his arms in graceful motions, almost like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. But here's the most amazing part. He was humming, actual melodic humming that matched the music perfectly. "Elena, in 15 years of working with autistic children, I've never seen anything quite like it." Elena's voice trembled as she responded. "Mrs. Patterson, he's been humming at home too. Very softly, usually when he's looking out the window or when we play hymns. It's like he's found his voice, but it's coming out through music first. I think you're exactly right. Music is often the first breakthrough for children with communication challenges, but Marcus's connection to melody seems unusually strong. Have you considered music therapy with a specialist? That evening, Elena researched music therapy programs in their area. She discovered that St. Michael's actually hosted a music ministry, specifically designed for children with special needs. Father Rodriguez had mentioned it briefly, but Elena hadn't realized the depth of the program. They met twice a week, focusing on using music as a bridge to communication and social interaction. She called Father Rodriguez that evening to inquire about the program. His warm voice immediately put her at ease. "Elena, I was actually hoping you would call about this. Sister Catherine, who leads our music ministry, has been asking about Marcus. She noticed his response to our hymns and believes he might benefit tremendously from our program. Father, I have to ask you something, and I hope it doesn't sound strange, but Marcus seems to be having some kind of spiritual experience. He's showing behaviors and responses that we've never seen before, all connected to religious imagery and sacred spaces. Is it possible for a child with autism to have genuine spiritual encounters?" Father Rodriguez paused thoughtfully before responding. "Elena, I've been serving this community for over 15 years, and I've learned that God speaks to each person in the language they can best understand. For some, it's through scripture. For others, through music or art, or Marcus is receiving nature. Perhaps divine communication in ways that bypass traditional verbal processing." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. Someone in spiritual authority was validating what she had been sensing about her son's experiences. "Father, would it be possible for us to meet with Sister Catherine before committing to the program? I want to make sure it would be appropriate for Marcus." "Of course. Why don't you bring Marcus by tomorrow afternoon? Sister Catherine will be preparing for Wednesday evening's session, and she'd love to meet him personally." Tuesday afternoon found the Johnson family walking through the halls of St. Michael's Parish building. Marcus moved with the same confident purposefulness he had shown in the sanctuary. When they reached the music room, Elena could hear the gentle sound of piano music drifting through the closed door. Sister Catherine was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands that moved gracefully across the piano keys. When she saw Marcus, her face lit up with immediate understanding. "You must be Marcus," she said softly, continuing to play. "I've heard wonderful things about you." Marcus walked directly to the piano and stood beside it, watching Sister Catherine's fingers move across the keys. The melody she was playing was simple but beautiful, something that seemed to resonate in the peaceful space between silence and song. "Marcus, would you like to try?" Sister Catherine asked, gesturing toward the bench beside her. Elena started to explain that Marcus had never shown interest in musical instruments, but before she could speak, her son climbed onto the bench and placed his small fingers on the keys. What happened next defied everything Elena thought she knew about her child's capabilities. Marcus began pressing keys in a pattern that, while simple, created actual melody, not random noise, not the chaotic banging that most 5-year-olds produce on a piano, but intentional musical phrases that seemed to echo the hymns they had been hearing at Sunday services. Sister Catherine's eyes widened with amazement. "Elena, has Marcus had any musical training?" she asked quietly, not wanting to interrupt the flow of music coming from the small boy beside her. "None at all. We don't even have a piano at home. This is the first time he's ever touched one." Elena felt that familiar sensation of witnessing something impossible, something that challenged everything she understood about autism and communication and her son's limitations. David moved closer to watch Marcus's hands on the keys. The melodies were simple, but they were definitely melodies. There was structure, rhythm, and most remarkably, emotion flowing through the music. Marcus's face showed the same peaceful concentration they had observed during his window conversations and his moments of prayer in church. Sister Catherine began playing along with Marcus, adding harmonies that supported and enhanced the melodies he was creating. Together, They filled the small room with music that seemed to carry something sacred within its notes. Elena found herself crying again, but these were tears of joy and wonder rather than the tears of frustration and worry that had marked so many years of their journey. "Marcus has a gift," Sister Catherine said gently as the music naturally came to an end. "This isn't just coincidence or accident. He's connecting with music on a level that suggests real understanding and ability. I would love to work with him if you're willing." Elena looked at David, both of them amazed by what they had just witnessed. Their son, who struggled with basic communication, had just engaged in musical conversation with a stranger. "Sister Catherine, what exactly would the program involve?" "We meet twice a week for an hour each session. The group is small, usually 4 or 5 children, all with different abilities and challenges. We use music as a bridge to communication, social interaction, and spiritual connection. For Marcus specifically, I think we could explore using music as his primary language for expression." Marcus remained at the piano, occasionally pressing keys to create soft, gentle sounds. Elena noticed that he kept looking toward a small statue of the Virgin Mary that sat on a shelf near the window. His expression held that same reverent attention she had observed in the main sanctuary. "Sister Catherine, Marcus seems particularly drawn to images of the that something Virgin Mary. Is you've seen with other children?" Elena asked. The older woman smiled knowingly. "Oh yes, quite often actually. Many children with special needs seem to have an intuitive connection to Mary's maternal presence. There's something about her gentle, unconditional love that speaks to hearts that may struggle with other forms of communication. We often incorporate Marian hymns into our sessions." As if responding to their conversation, Marcus began playing a melody that Elena recognized as Ave Maria. The notes were simplified, played with one finger, but the tune was unmistakably there. Elena gasped softly, wondering how her son could possibly know this hymn when they had never heard it at home. Sister Catherine joined in, her experienced fingers adding the full harmonies that transformed Marcus's simple melody into something transcendent. The room filled with sacred music surrounding them, and Elena felt the presence of something holy. This wasn't just music therapy. This was worship, communication, and healing all woven together in ways that touched the deepest parts of the human spirit. When they finished, Marcus turned to look directly at Sister Catherine and smiled, a full, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. Elena had seen this smile only a handful of times in his 5 years of life, but here it was, bright and clear and filled with connection. "I think we've found Marcus's voice," Sister Catherine said quietly. "It may not be verbal in the traditional sense, but music is definitely his language, and through music, I believe we can help him find other forms of expression as well." Elena felt hope rising in her chest, like a sunrise after a long, dark night. For years, she had wondered if Marcus would ever be able to communicate his thoughts, his feelings, his needs. Now she was beginning to understand that he had been communicating all along, just not in ways she had recognized. They enrolled Marcus in Sister Catherine's program immediately. His first official session was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and Elena spent the intervening day researching the connection between autism, music, and spiritual experience. What she discovered amazed her. Studies showed that children with autism often process music differently than neurotypical children, sometimes with enhanced ability to recognize patterns, melodies, and emotional content in musical compositions. Some researchers theorized that music activated different neural pathways, creating bridges to communication that bypass traditional language centers in the brain. But beyond the scientific explanations, Elena found story after story of families who had experienced breakthroughs with their autistic children through music, particularly sacred music. Parents described children who had never spoken beginning to hum hymns, kids who avoided social interaction suddenly participating in musical groups, and young people finding their voices through melodies when words had failed them for years. Thursday afternoon arrived with Marcus already dressed and waiting by the door 45 minutes before they needed to leave for his session. Elena found him sitting on the floor, humming softly while arranging his toy, cars in patterns that looked increasingly like musical notation. She knelt beside him, studying the careful arrangements. "Marcus, are you making music with your cars?" she asked gently. Her son looked up at her and nodded, then pointed to the patterns he had created. Elena realized he was trying to show her something, trying to communicate through visual representation what he was experiencing musically. David joined them on the floor, marveling at the complexity of Marcus's arrangements. "Elena, look at this. These aren't random patterns. There's structure here. Repetition, variation. It's like he's composing something." Elena felt that familiar flutter of excitement that came with witnessing new developments in Marcus's capabilities. Every day seemed to bring fresh evidence that their son's mind was far more active and creative than anyone had realized. The autism hadn't limited his intelligence. It had simply channeled it in directions that required different kinds of understanding and appreciation. The drive to St. Michael's was filled with Marcus's soft humming from the back seat. Elena recognized fragments of the hymns they had heard during Sunday services, but Marcus was also creating variations, adding his own melodic phrases that somehow enhanced the original compositions. "David, listen to him." Elena whisks, just repeating what he's heard. "He's creating new period. He's not music based on what he's learned. That memory requires understanding and creativity all working together." David nodded, his eyes meeting Elena's in the rearview mirror. "I keep thinking about all those specialists who told us what Marcus would never be able to do. They never mentioned what he might be able to do that other kids can't." When they arrived at the parish building, Marcus practically bounced out of his car seat with excitement. He walked quickly toward the music room, his steps light and purposeful. Elena had never seen him show such eager anticipation for any activity. Sister Catherine greeted them at the door with her warm smile. "Marcus, I've been looking forward to making music with you again," she said gently. Marcus looked directly at her and, to Elena's amazement, attempted to wave. The gesture was awkward and uncertain, but it was clearly intentional social communication. The music room had been prepared for the group session. 4 other children were already there with their parents, each dealing with different challenges and abilities. Elena felt a moment of nervousness about how Marcus would interact in a group setting, but Sister Catherine seemed to sense her concern. "Marcus, would you like to show our friends what you discovered on the piano?" Sister Catherine asked, gesturing toward the instrument. Marcus nodded and walked confidently to the bench, his small fingers finding the keys as naturally as if he had been playing for years. He began with the simple melody they had explored during his first visit, but this time he added variations and embellishments that demonstrated remarkable musical intuition. The other children in the room grew quiet, drawn into the peaceful sounds that seemed to create a sacred atmosphere around them. One by one, the other children began to respond to Marcus's music. A little girl with Down syndrome started swaying to the rhythm. A boy with cerebral palsy began tapping his hand against his wheelchair in time with the melody. A child with selective mutism started humming along softly. Elena watched in wonder as her son, who had always struggled with social connections, became the catalyst for group interaction through his musical expression. Sister Catherine began playing harmonies that supported and enhanced what Marcus was creating, and soon the entire room was filled with collaborative music making. "This is beautiful, Marcus," Sister Catherine said, as the impromptu session came to a natural conclusion. "You have a gift for bringing people together through music." Marcus looked around the room at the other children, and Elena saw something in his expression that made her heart soar. He was seeing himself as part of a community, connected to others through the universal language of melody and rhythm. The formal session that followed built on this spontaneous success. Sister Catherine guided the children through simple musical exercises that encouraged interaction and communication. Marcus participated fully, his confidence growing with each activity. During a quiet moment while the other children worked on individual projects, Marcus approached Sister Catherine and tugged gently on her sleeve. When she knelt down to his level, he pointed toward the statue of the Virgin Mary and then placed his hand over his heart. "Marcus, would you like to play something special for Mary?" Sister Catherine asked softly. Marcus nodded eagerly and returned to the piano. What he played next brought tears to every adult eye in the room. The melody was Ave Maria, but not the simplified version he had played before. This was more complex, more nuanced, filled with emotional depth that seemed impossible from such a young child. As he played, Marcus's face showed the same peaceful reverence Elena had observed during his prayer times at home and in church. Sister Catherine began singing softly, along with Marcus's playing, her voice adding words to his wordless communication. The other children grew quiet, drawn into the sacred moment that was unfolding before them. Even the most active and restless child in the group sat still, captivated by the music. When the song ended, Marcus remained at the piano for a moment, his hands resting on the keys. Then he looked up at the statue of the Virgin Mary and moved his lips in what Elena now recognized as his silent prayer language. The room held a reverent silence that seemed to acknowledge something holy had just taken place. Elena felt overwhelmed by gratitude and wonder. Her son, who had been locked in silence for 5 years, was finding his voice through sacred music. He was connecting with others, expressing his deepest feelings, and participating in worship in ways that touched everyone around him. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Sister Catherine pulled Elena aside. "I want you to know that Marcus is extraordinary. In 30 years of music ministry, I've rarely seen a child with such intuitive understanding of sacred music. He's not just playing notes. He's communicating something profound about his spiritual experience." Elena nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Sister Catherine, I feel like we're witnessing a miracle. Not just that Marcus is making music, but that through music, he's becoming more himself than we've ever seen him before." "Elena, I believe that's exactly what's happening. Music is revealing who Marcus has always been inside. The autism hasn't changed his soul. It simply meant that his soul expresses itself differently. And what a beautiful expression it is." That evening at home, Marcus continued to amaze his parents. Instead of his usual evening routine, he went to the children's Bible Elena had placed in his room and opened it to the picture of Mary and baby Jesus. He studied the image for several minutes, then began humming the melody he had played that afternoon. Elena sat beside him on his bed, listening to her son's musical prayer. "Marcus, do you feel close to Mary when you play music?" she asked softly. Marcus looked at her and nodded, then pointed to the picture and then to his heart. Elena understood. Mary wasn't just an image to him. She was a presence, a comfort, a maternal figure who met him in the silent spaces of his heart. As Elena tucked Marcus into bed that night, she marveled at the journey their family had taken in just a few short weeks. From desperation and isolation to hope and community. From silence to sacred music. From limitation to revelation. Marcus fell asleep with his small hand resting on the open Bible, his face peaceful and content. Elena stood in his doorway for a long time, watching him sleep and praying prayers of gratitude for the mysterious ways that healing and hope had entered their lives. The next morning brought surprise that another would prove to be the beginning of the yet most remarkable development in Marcus's journey. Elena woke to the sound of humming coming from the kitchen. Not unusual anymore, except that the humming was more complex than she had heard before, with multiple melodic lines woven together in sophisticated harmonies. When she reached the window, the kitchen, she found Marcus standing at, but he wasn't alone in his musical expression. Somehow, impossibly, he seemed to be harmonizing with himself, creating layered melodies that filled the morning air with something that sounded almost angelic. Elena rubbed her eyes and listened more carefully. The harmonies were definitely coming from Marcus, but they were beyond what any 5-year-old should be capable of creating. It was as if he were channeling music from some source beyond his own limited experience. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the same beautiful sounds. He and Elena stood together, listening to their son create music that seemed to come from heaven itself. And in that moment, they both sensed that they were on the verge of witnessing something that would change not just their family, but everyone who would soon hear the voice that God was preparing to give their precious son. This is the miracle that changed everything Elena and David thought they knew about their son. Marcus found his voice not through years of therapy or medical intervention, but through a divine encounter that opened doors no earthly treatment had been able to unlock. Today, Marcus continues to grow in his musical abilities and his faith, touching hearts everywhere he goes. His story reminds us that miracles still happen, and sometimes the most profound healing comes not from what we can understand, but from what we surrender to divine love. What do you think about Marcus's incredible journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith and hope.